As winter darkness settles over the frozen expanse of Greenland, Danish soldiers patrol a territory so vast that their entire nation could fit inside it 17 times over. They have orders from Copenhagen to shoot first and ask questions later if American forces attempt to land on their Arctic territory. European allies are rushing token forces to stand beside them in solidarity against the world's most powerful military. Politicians warn gravely that any American action would shatter NATO and destabilize the entire Western alliance. But behind the defiant press conferences and the stern diplomatic communiques, every defense ministry in Europe knows a truth they dare not speak aloud. If America decides to take Greenland, nobody can stop them. This is why Denmark, Europe, and every nation opposing American ambitions in the Arctic will fail, not heroically, but miserably. Before we dive in, why not hit subscribe and drop a like? It really helps out. To understand just how hopeless Denmark's position truly is, we must first confront the sheer, almost obscene disparity in military power between these two nations. According to Global Firepower's 2025 military rankings, the United States stands first among 145 nations with a power index of 0.0744, the closest thing to military perfection the modern world has ever measured. Denmark sits at 45th, with a power index of 0.8109, a gap so vast that comparisons become almost meaningless, like measuring the ocean against a swimming pool. But raw rankings, sterile as they are, cannot capture just how absurd this mismatch truly is when translated into steel and fire. The United States operates 13,043 military aircraft, enough to darken the skies over entire continents, while Denmark operates 117. America fields 1,790 fighter jets, each one capable of delivering precision death from beyond the horizon, while Denmark has 31. The U.S. Air Force maintains 647 special mission aircraft for electronic warfare, surveillance and battlefield command, machines that can blind an enemy before the first shot is fired, while Denmark has 3. America possesses 5,843 helicopters, including over 1,000 gunships bristling with missiles and cannons, while Denmark has 34 helicopters, none of them armed for combat. On the frozen ground where any Arctic battle would ultimately be decided, the numbers tell an equally devastating story. The United States fields 4,640 main battle tanks, armored leviathans that can punch through defensive lines like paper, while Denmark operates 44. American armored vehicle strength stands at 391,963 machines of war, while Denmark fields 3,856. The U.S. Army deploys 641 mobile rocket launchers capable of saturating entire grid squares with explosive death, while Denmark has 8. At sea, where any operation against Greenland would truly be decided, the disparity becomes not just lopsided but almost comical in its extremity. The United States Navy sails 440 vessels across the world's oceans, including 11 nuclear-powered supercarriers and 70 submarines prowling beneath the waves like steel predators. Denmark's entire navy consists of 50 vessels, with 0 aircraft carriers and 0 submarines, a coast guard pretending to be a blue water fleet. The U.S. fields 81 guided missile destroyers, each one carrying enough firepower to level a small city, while Denmark has none. Denmark operates 9 frigates, respectable ships in their own right, but ships that would face American carrier strike groups projecting more combat power than most nations' entire armed forces. And then there is the question of manpower, the human beings who would be asked to fight and die in this impossible contest. The United States maintains 1,328,000 active-duty military personnel, backed by nearly 800,000 trained reservists ready to deploy. Denmark has 20,000 active soldiers and 12,000 reserves, a force that could comfortably fit inside a mid-sized American football stadium with seats to spare. To put this in perspective that illuminates the absurdity, Denmark's entire military is smaller than the New York Police Department, which employs approximately 35,000 officers to patrol a single city. A single American carrier strike group, one of 11, carries more raw combat power than Denmark's entire armed forces combined, multiplied several times over. When Danish officials speak gravely about their troops having orders to shoot first, they are not describing a defense strategy. They are describing a suicide mission dressed in patriotic language. But Denmark, of course, is not planning to face the American colossus alone. They are counting on NATO solidarity and the combined might of European arms. After President Trump renewed his demands for Greenland, European nations rushed to demonstrate their support for beleaguered Copenhagen with announcements that sounded impressive in headlines. Germany, the economic engine of Europe and heir to one of history's most formidable military traditions, announced it was deploying 13 military personnel to Greenland for an exploration mission lasting 3 days. 13 soldiers for 3 days against the most powerful military machine in human history. France, whose presidents speak grandly of European strategic autonomy and independence from American dominance, declared that a military team was already on the ground and would be reinforced with air, sea, and land components. Finland, a nation that once held off the Soviet Union in the frozen forests of the Winter War, contributed 2 military liaison officers to the cause. Sweden sent an unspecified handful of troops, Norway contributed 2 personnel, and the grand European coalition to defend Danish sovereignty began to take shape. This is not a defense force assembled to repel an invasion. This is a diplomatic gesture dressed in camouflage uniforms and combat boots. Combined, these European deployments probably number fewer than 100 soldiers, a symbolic garrison facing a nation that projects power across every ocean on Earth. But let us engage in fantasy for a moment and assume that Europe decides to get serious about defending Greenland with real military force. Even in this scenario, the mathematics of power remain brutally, unforgivingly simple. The numbers do not work. According to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, the entire European NATO contingent, stripped of American assets, fields approximately 210 combat-capable aircraft in the United Kingdom, with Germany's air force being smaller and France's not significantly larger. Combined, every fighter jet in European NATO cannot match the inventory of the American Air Force alone, let alone the Navy and Marine Corps aviation wings. Europe possesses 2 aircraft carriers in total, both British, neither one capable of matching the combat power of a single American supercarrier with its 90 aircraft and nuclear propulsion. The United States operates 11 such supercarriers, plus 9 amphibious assault ships that individually dwarf most nations' flagship vessels in size and capability. And here is the strategic reality that European defense planners understand but cannot publicly acknowledge. Europe cannot project significant military power to Greenland without American permission. Any European naval task force sailing to reinforce Greenland would have to cross the Atlantic through waters dominated by American attack submarines, carrier battle groups, and surveillance systems that track every vessel larger than a fishing boat. Any European air deployment would have to fly through American-monitored airspace or refuel at bases where Washington exercises decisive influence over what takes off and what stays grounded. Greenland itself already hosts Pituffik Space Base, America's northernmost military installation, where approximately 150 U.S. troops already stand on Arctic soil. If America decided to reinforce that existing foothold, European forces would be attempting to establish a presence on territory where the American flag already flies. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen has warned with apparent conviction that a U.S. attack on Greenland would end NATO as we know it. She is correct in this assessment, but not in the way she imagines or hopes. NATO would not end because Europe heroically rallied to defend a fellow member against American aggression. NATO would end because Europe would do nothing meaningful, exposing the alliance as a paper tiger that roars only when Washington approves. European leaders understand this reality perfectly well, which explains why their actual responses have been so carefully calibrated to appear strong while committing to nothing. Notice the telling silence from Europe's most powerful capitals. France, Germany, and the United Kingdom have studiously avoided directly criticizing President Trump over his Greenland demands. When journalists pressed British Prime Minister Keir Starmer about American threats against a NATO ally whose territory London is theoretically obligated to defend, he prevaricated and pointed to an earlier, vaguer statement. French President Emmanuel Macron, who never misses an opportunity to lecture the world about European values and sovereignty, dodged similar questions with practiced diplomatic evasion. Why this sudden outbreak of diplomatic laryngitis among leaders who normally compete to claim the moral high ground on every issue? Since you've made it this far, you're clearly enjoying the content, so please hit subscribe and drop a like. It helps more than you think. With that said, let's get back to it. Because European capitals need American support for Ukraine far more than they need to defend Danish pride over an Arctic island most Europeans cannot locate on a map. Europe has been funding Ukraine's desperate defense for years now, dependent on American weapons systems, American intelligence, and American logistical networks to keep Kyiv in the fight. They cannot afford to antagonize Washington over Greenland while Russian armor still threatens the eastern frontiers of the continent they actually inhabit. As one analyst explained to CNN with unusual candor, European governments are far more likely to pressure Copenhagen to reach an accommodation with America than to risk their own relationship with Washington. This is the cold, unsentimental calculation of international politics stripped of its rhetorical decoration. Denmark is expendable, Ukraine is not. Now let us examine the claim, repeated with great solemnity in editorial pages and diplomatic forums, that international law and global institutions would somehow constrain American action. To see how hollow this hope truly is, we need only look at what happened 12 days ago in Venezuela. In the pre-dawn darkness of January 3, 2026, while most of Caracas slept beneath a humid tropical sky, 150 American aircraft screamed through Venezuelan airspace. Special operations teams descended on ropes through shattered skylights, and within 30 minutes, a sitting head of state was dragged from his fortified compound in the heart of his own capital city. Nicolas Maduro, the man who had defied Washington for over a decade, woke up a president and went to sleep in American custody, awaiting trial in a Manhattan federal courtroom. The world watched in astonishment as the United States demonstrated exactly what American power looks like when Washington decides to act. The United Nations Security Council convened with great urgency on January 5th, summoned at the request of China, Russia, and Colombia, who demanded accountability for this brazen violation of sovereignty. Russian and Chinese diplomats pounded tables and demanded Maduro's immediate release, invoking sacred principles of sovereignty that their own nations violate routinely. The American representatives sat calmly, rejected their characterization of the operation as military aggression, and described it instead as a targeted law enforcement measure against an indicted criminal. The result of this grand convocation of international authority was precisely nothing. Maduro remained in his Manhattan cell, and the meeting adjourned. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres called the operation a dangerous precedent and worried publicly that the rules of international law had not been respected. Then he returned to his office to draft more statements because the United Nations possesses no mechanism to compel American compliance with anything. The International Criminal Court cannot prosecute American officials because the United States never ratified the Rome Statute and refuses to recognize the court's jurisdiction. Economic sanctions against America are functionally impossible because the dollar remains the world's reserve currency and American markets are essential to global commerce and investment. International condemnation, however eloquently phrased, is ultimately just words, and words do not stop aircraft carriers or special operations forces. The Maduro operation proved definitively what cynical observers had long suspected. When America decides to act, international institutions can only watch, protest, and ultimately accept the new reality. If the United States can snatch a head of state from his own capital in 30 minutes while the world watches helplessly, what protection can international law offer Denmark? But surely the argument goes, Russia and China would not permit America to simply seize control of the Arctic's most strategically valuable territory without response. These great power rivals, who challenge American influence everywhere from the South China Sea to the Syrian desert, would certainly prevent Washington from redrawing the map of the Northern Hemisphere. To evaluate this comforting theory, let us examine what Russia and China actually did when America executed Operation Absolute Resolve against Venezuela. Russia issued statements of condemnation drafted in the strongest diplomatic language, demanded Maduro's immediate release, and threatened unspecified consequences that never materialized. China called for respect for Venezuelan sovereignty, expressed deep concern through official channels, and abstained from any intervention that might actually change the situation. Neither country fired a single shot, repositioned a single warship, or did anything beyond diplomatic protests that achieved exactly nothing. Russia could not intervene to save Venezuela, supposedly a key ally in the Western Hemisphere, because projecting military power across the Atlantic while fighting a grinding war in Ukraine exceeds Moscow's actual capabilities. China could not intervene because the People's Liberation Army Navy, while growing impressively, remains primarily focused on the Pacific and cannot challenge American dominance in waters so far from home. Now consider Greenland's location on the map and what it would require for either rival to meaningfully contest American control. The island sits in the North Atlantic, positioned between North America and Europe, firmly within the zone of absolute American naval and air superiority that has existed since 1945. Any Russian attempt to defend Greenland would require the Northern Fleet to sail past American attack submarines lurking in the deep, through waters monitored by American satellites and patrol aircraft, to reach an island where America already operates a military base. Russia's Northern Fleet includes formidable nuclear submarines and capable surface combatants, but it was designed to protect the Russian homeland, not to project power across an ocean dominated by a superior adversary. Their ability to sustain combat operations near Greenland against determined American opposition is not limited. It is essentially non-existent. China's strategic situation regarding Greenland is, if anything, even more hopeless than Russia's. Despite Beijing's creative self-designation as a near-Arctic state, China maintains no significant military presence anywhere within thousands of miles of Greenland. Chinese naval vessels would have to sail from the Western Pacific, through choke points monitored by American allies, across an ocean where American and Allied navies have hunted submarines since the Cold War. China's icebreaker fleet is expanding but remains wholly incapable of supporting military operations in the Arctic against American opposition and hostile environmental conditions. Beijing's Arctic strategy relies entirely on economic investment and patient diplomatic cultivation, not military force projection that its navy cannot yet achieve. When Stephen Miller, Trump's senior advisor, declared flatly that nobody is going to fight the United States militarily over the future of Greenland, he was not issuing a threat or boasting. He was stating an obvious strategic fact that every military planner in Moscow and Beijing has already incorporated into their assessments of the situation. Russia and China will condemn any American action regarding Greenland with the same theatrical outrage they displayed after the Venezuela operation. And just as with Venezuela, their condemnation will achieve precisely nothing beyond generating headlines that will be forgotten within a news cycle. But let us indulge one final hypothetical. What if the impossible happened and everyone united against American expansion? What if Europe, Russia and China somehow set aside their irreconcilable differences to form a grand coalition opposing American control of Greenland? First, we must acknowledge that this coalition is geopolitically impossible because Europe is currently engaged in a proxy war with Russia over Ukraine's survival. Germany, France, and the United Kingdom have spent years arming Kyiv against Moscow. They will not suddenly ally with the Kremlin against Washington over Arctic real estate. Second, even if such an improbable alliance somehow materialized, it would still lose any confrontation with American power. The combined nuclear arsenals of every nation outside America are dwarfed by the American strategic arsenal, which was built to deter the Soviet Union at its peak. The United States and Russia together possess 90% of the world's 12,000 nuclear warheads, and Washington is not going to launch against Moscow over Greenland. France and the United Kingdom maintain approximately 500 nuclear weapons between them, while China fields around 350. No coalition, however configured, would risk nuclear escalation over Greenland, and without that ultimate threat, they cannot compel American withdrawal from anywhere. The mathematics of deterrence are simple. Nobody trades their civilization for an Arctic island, no matter how valuable. Understanding why America would risk international friction for Greenland requires examining what makes this frozen territory so extraordinarily valuable to Washington's strategic planners. Greenland is not simply another piece of territory to be colored on a map. It is arguably the most strategically significant real estate in the entire Northern Hemisphere. The island sits directly astride the shortest flight path between Russia and the continental United States, making it the first line of defense against nuclear attack from America's most dangerous adversary. This is why Pituffik Space Base exists in the frozen darkness, to provide early warning of Russian intercontinental ballistic missiles arcing over the pole toward American cities. As climate change accelerates and polar ice retreats, the Arctic is transforming from a frozen wasteland into the newest arena of great power competition. The Arctic is warming 4 times faster than the rest of the planet, and scientists project that ice-free summers may arrive by 2035, opening waters that have been locked since prehistory. New shipping routes are emerging that will fundamentally reshape global commerce and the strategic calculations that depend on it. The Northern Sea route along Russia's coast already operates during summer months, cutting shipping time from Asia to Europe by nearly half compared to the Suez Canal passage. A transpolar route directly across the Arctic Ocean may become commercially viable within the next decade, creating new choke points and new opportunities for those who control them. Greenland sits at the western gateway to these emerging trade arteries, positioned to become one of the 21st century's most critical maritime choke points. And beneath Greenland's retreating glaciers lies a treasure that makes its strategic location seem almost secondary. The island ranks 8th in the world for rare earth reserves, containing minerals essential for smartphones, electric vehicles, wind turbines, and the advanced weapons systems that maintain American military dominance. The Kvanefjeld project alone holds one of the world's largest deposits of rare earth elements alongside significant uranium reserves waiting to be extracted. A 2023 geological survey revealed that 25 of the 34 minerals the European Commission classifies as critical raw materials exist in exploitable quantities beneath Greenland's ice. The U.S. Geological Survey estimates Greenland contains 31 billion barrels of oil equivalent in hydrocarbons, a reserve comparable to America's entire proven crude inventory. Currently, China dominates global rare earth processing and has repeatedly weaponized this control during geopolitical disputes, restricting exports to Japan and threatening similar measures against America. Securing Greenland's mineral wealth would shatter Chinese dominance over resources that will define the next industrial revolution and the military balance that depends on it. These strategic and economic imperatives explain why the United States has attempted to acquire Greenland at least 4 times since 1867, when Secretary Seward first proposed the purchase. In 1946, with the Cold War dawning and Soviet intentions unclear, President Truman offered Denmark $100 million in gold for the island. Denmark refused the money but could not refuse American military protection, because without the United States standing guard, Soviet forces would have walked in unchallenged. For 80 years since that moment, America has defended Greenland with blood and treasure while Denmark collected the political benefits and pretended the arrangement was somehow equal. Now, with the Arctic emerging as the next great arena of superpower competition, the United States is simply acknowledging a reality that Copenhagen has denied for decades. The current arrangement serves nothing except Danish pride. Denmark's moral authority to lecture anyone about Greenlandic welfare collapses entirely under examination of their actual record governing the island. In the 1960s and 1970s, Danish health authorities forcibly implanted intrauterine devices in as many as 4,500 Greenlandic women and girls, some as young as 12, without obtaining consent. The explicit purpose was to suppress the indigenous birth rate. The result was cutting Greenland's fertility in half within a few years of implementation. Denmark did not apologize for this systematic violation until September 2025, and only after an independent investigation confirmed what traumatized survivors had been saying for decades. A nation that subjected indigenous women to forced contraception campaigns has forfeited any standing to lecture America about respecting Greenlandic sovereignty. The Greenlandic people themselves are increasingly seeing through Copenhagen's paternalistic pretensions about protecting their interests. A 2025 poll found that 84% of Greenlanders support independence from Denmark, a dramatic increase from 67% just 6 years earlier. Every major political party in Greenland now officially endorses independence as a goal, spanning the entire ideological spectrum from left to right. Only 9% of Greenlanders express any desire to remain permanently under Danish control, a colonial remnant that most would rather escape. Yes, 85% of Greenlanders also say they do not wish to become American, but that number represents a negotiating position, not a final answer. What Greenlanders actually want is self-determination and economic development, both of which America can deliver and Denmark has systematically prevented. Denmark maintains Greenlandic dependency through an annual subsidy of roughly $500 million that funds half the government budget, creating learned helplessness rather than prosperity. Copenhagen has blocked foreign investment and refused to support genuine economic independence that might allow Greenland to stand on its own feet. This is not benevolent stewardship of a treasured territory. It is colonial control maintained through welfare payments and bureaucratic obstruction. So let us summarize clearly, without diplomatic euphemism, why every defense of Greenland against American power will fail. Denmark's military is smaller than the New York Police Department and would be annihilated in any direct confrontation lasting longer than hours. Europe's token deployments are diplomatic gestures designed for press releases, not serious military commitments that could affect any outcome. European powers will not sacrifice their relationship with Washington over Danish territory when they desperately need American support against Russian aggression. The United Nations can condemn American action with resolutions drafted in the strongest possible language, but it cannot compel compliance. International law, however solemnly invoked, possesses no enforcement mechanism capable of constraining American power when vital interests are at stake. Russia cannot project meaningful force to the North Atlantic while bleeding resources in Ukraine and facing American naval superiority in every relevant theater. China possesses no military capability to operate effectively near Greenland against American opposition that controls every approach. No conceivable coalition of powers would risk nuclear confrontation over an Arctic island, however strategically valuable it may be. Operation Absolute Resolve demonstrated with brutal clarity exactly how America handles obstacles to its vital strategic interests in the 21st century. 150 aircraft, special operations forces descending from the darkness, and 30 minutes to capture a head of state from his own fortified capital. The world condemned the operation in every available forum, and absolutely nothing changed. Maduro remains in American custody awaiting trial. If America can accomplish that against Venezuela, a nation with Russian and Chinese backing and its own substantial military, what realistic chance does Denmark have? The only remaining question is whether Denmark accepts this reality through negotiation or learns it through demonstration. President Trump has offered Copenhagen a choice: work with America on an arrangement that benefits all parties, or watch America take what it requires regardless. The intelligent course for Danish leaders is to negotiate seriously while they retain some leverage over terms. Because leverage is something Denmark is rapidly exhausting with every defiant press conference and every symbolic troop deployment, Greenland's future will be determined by the great powers of the 21st century, not by a small European nation clinging to colonial-era claims it cannot defend. America defended Greenland when Denmark could not protect itself from Nazi occupation, and the island was essential to Atlantic convoy survival. America has protected Greenland for 80 years, while Denmark systematically underfunded its military and devoted its energy to lecturing others about human rights. Now the United States is simply claiming what 8 decades of service have earned. control over territory it has defended, resources it requires, and strategic positions that will define Arctic security for the next century. Denmark can participate in this transition as a cooperative partner, or Danish leaders can stand aside and observe events unfold without their input. Either way, the outcome has already been determined by disparities in power that rhetoric cannot alter. Nobody is going to fight the United States over Greenland because nobody possesses the capability to do so and survive. Subscribe for more geopolitical analysis and share your prediction in the comments. How long before Denmark finally accepts the reality that everyone else already sees?